All right, so this week, this may be a two-parter. I started putting it together and it started getting a little long, so we're going to go as far as we can go. And I may do an addendum to this one next week or the week after, which will be a continuation of the testing into actually automating your test scripts. This one today, though, we're going to talk about building a product catalog again. This will be part 5 in our series. We're going to look at how to build tests for the MVC web application we created last time. So up till now, we have gone over what is a product catalog, where we looked at understanding what makes up the product catalog and walked through a use case for designing a generic real-world product catalog. Then we looked at understanding the ways to store data, focusing on the different types of data files we can use for storing data, and then converting the data files into a database. And then from there, we went on to build the standalone Java application that interacted with our database with the basic CRUD functionalities in test cases. We kind of glossed over that, which will be what we expand on today. But today's going to build on the last lesson, which is where we built a fully functional CRUD application using the Spring MVC framework and Tomcat to essentially have a web application where we can interact with our database from a nice web GUI. And for those of you that don't know what a CRUD is, it's essentially a create, read, update, and delete application. So essentially we've simulated a database integration tool, something like SQL, Microsoft Access, or DB Visualizer, any database tool where you can actually go in and edit or manipulate your database. We've essentially just created a GUI portion for our product catalog, so now we can actually interact with our database. Today, in today's lesson, we will be covering how to build some tests into our application to make sure it is functioning correctly. For starters, we will discuss why it is important to test our code, and then we will quickly review the different types of testing frameworks that we can use. Then we will also look at one of the most important, or not important, but most popular open source testing tool available, which is Selenium. And then finally, we will cover unit tests and starting to build out our test cases. So I'm going to actually start out by opening this up for discussion. So why should we test our code?
Because no code is bugless.
All right, that's one. Dave, I'm sure you have something.
Yeah, I mean, pretty much to provide whatever the customer expectations. So that's why we test our code. Like, you should verify whether it's working according to what the customer needs or what the business is expecting.
Okay, moving on. So essentially, some of the pros and cons of testing. So pros, we want to, as you test your code, you're actually, in a sense, documenting your code. Because as you walk through, if you do your testing right, you have to fully understand the application you're testing, in which case you might as well build the documentation out so you get better documentation. It helps prevent defects. So as Tim said and as Dave said, no code is truly bug-free. Another thing is it stops stupid mistakes. A lot of times when you accidentally do something dumb and it gets by your initial testing, or you make a piece of code change in one spot, not realizing it changes somewhere else, testing catches that. You can also increase the number of tests through automation. So you can create multiple test cases and put them in a test suite and run them multiple times. However, from the business perspective, there's a couple cons. So one of the biggest cons is all your tests must be maintained. So if you design your test poorly, the maintenance piece of this can be very costly and very time-consuming. Tests may be difficult to write. In the place where I currently work, one of the issues we run into right now is the test cases we're using are written in Java. However, none of our testers know Java. So there's a little bit of a learning curve to bring them up to speed. However, if you build the test framework correctly, that really shouldn't be an issue. Another issue is company buy-in. It can take too long to implement testing. I've worked in a bunch of shops where testing is completely obsolete. There is no QA whatsoever. In their minds, the coders are the testers, which is the worst possible situation you want to be in, because if you're the person down in the weeds writing the code, you're only going to test what you're working on at that time. So chances of you doing a full regression are slim to none. So therefore, a lot of bugs can go out the door. And early on, there will be lots of refactoring, meaning if you start writing a lot of test cases at the start of a project, if that project changes quickly over time, you're going to be going back a lot and refactoring and redoing this test again and again. To help prevent that last part, though, we can look at using frameworks. So why use a framework? The simple answer, for the same reason that we would use a GPS when commuting or when we write up an outline before writing a paper. The key point, preparation, being prepared. Frameworks, well, let me step back. So let me explain. When you can jump, well, for starters, you could just jump in and start pounding and clicking away, entering data to test an application. It's best not to do that, however, at least not without doing a little planning first. Otherwise, you can quickly end up with a boatload of tests with no real consensus of what you are testing, or a bunch of test scripts that do the same thing. Similar to jumping in your car and driving to a destination without knowing exactly where you're going. Unfortunately, I have seen companies do just that. For example, a common practice I have seen is using the Selenium IDE to create over 1,000 test cases using the tool's simple record and playback function. Then they export these recordings to scripts for playbacks, in many instances duplicating the test logic over and over again. So when the application changes significantly, all the tests had to be redone. In essence, they had to start over. Nothing could be reused. So they essentially had to go back and re-record 1,000 test cases. Yet this is where frameworks come in. So frameworks can help you reuse code, reduce maintenance costs, maximize coverage, and even increase your test coverage while decreasing the amount of time manual testing your code. So what are the types of frameworks? Well, the model-based testing framework is based on abstraction. For instance, in most web applications, there is a few set actions that are always executed. Rather than writing those actions again and again in our tests, we can group these actions together in a method and then call the method from our test scripts. So if we are coding using tests, this approach can help us avoid the duplication of effort or code. This is best seen when there are many changes to an application that impact a series of actions. Instead of having to go in and change each individual test, all you have to do is make changes to the main module method script. Next, we have the library architecture testing framework. This is fundamentally and foundationally built on the model-based testing framework with some additional advantages. It also is known as the structured scripting or functional decomposition. In this framework, test scripts are initially recorded by record and playback method. Later, common tasks inside the scripts are identified and grouped into functions. These functions are called by the main test script called driver in different ways to create test cases. In Selenium, this is essentially the WebDriver. Next, we have data-driven testing, or DDT. This helps the user segregate the test script logic and the test data from one another, allowing the user to store and test data in an external source. This external source can be property files, XML files, Excel files, text files, CSV files, ODBC repositories, databases, and so on. The data is conventionally stored in key value pairs. Thus, the key can be used to access and populate the data within the test scripts. The key-driven testing framework is an extension to the data-driven testing framework in a sense that it not only segregates the test data from the scripts, it also keeps certain sets of code belonging to the test scripts into an external data file. These set of codes, known as keywords, and hence the framework is so named keyword and self-guiding as to what action needs to be performed on the application. The keywords and the test data are stored in a tabular-like structure, and thus it is also popularly regarded as the table-driven framework. The idea behind the keyword-driven approach is automation. In automation, is to separate the coding from the test cases and test steps. This helps a non-technical person to have a clear understanding of the automation, such as a BA or a manual tester. The hybrid testing framework, as the name suggests, is a combination of more than one of the above-mentioned frameworks. The best thing about such a setup is that it leverages the benefits of all kinds of associated frameworks. Last, we have the behavior-driven development framework, which allows automation of functionality validations in easily readable and understandable formats to business analysts, developers, testers, and so on. Such frameworks do not necessarily require the user to be acquainted with programming languages, so BDD tools to consider are some of the tools to consider would be like Cucumber and JBehave. So what are some of the testing tools? So we've talked about frameworks, but what type of tools can we use out of the door to get us started without really having to jump into a framework off the bat? Well, we have Selenium. Like I said earlier, this is one of the most popular open source testing environments. Selenium is a portable software testing framework for web applications. It provides a record playback tool for automating tests without the need to learn a test scripting language. The tool also provides some other built-in functionalities to allow testers to include other non-record functionalities like waits and validations. So you can actually kind of script a little bit into the Selenium IDE without actually coding anything. It's a nice little drop-down GUI interface, which we'll look at later. Next, we have WebDriver. WebDriver is a tool for automating web applications testing and is particular to verify that they work as expected. It aims to provide a friendly application programming interface, or API for short, that's easy for developers to explore and understand. Cucumber is a tool-based or behavior-driven development tool or framework, which is used to write acceptance tests for web applications. This allows the automation of function validations in an easily readable and understanding format, like plain English, to business analysts, developers, and testers. Next, we have JBehave, which is a framework for behavior-driven development, BDD. Remember, behavior-driven development is an evolution of test-driven development and acceptance test-driven design, and is intended to make these practices more accessible and intuitive to newcomers and experts alike. It shifts the vocabulary from being a test-based to behavior-based and positions itself as a design philosophy. So not necessarily so much a framework, but more of a philosophy or design principle. Sauce Labs, which is one of my favorites, but is also one of the most expensive testing tools out there. Sauce Labs is the leader in cloud-based testing tools. So this is actually a company that sells tools for testing. So they have testing tools covering everything from continuous integration, cross-browser testing, mobile, manual testing, and more. It's just a matter of determining what you want to do for the price. They can start anywhere from like $29 a month, and they can go up to as high as $5,000 and charge you per minute for testing if you're hosting on their site. Lastly, we have HPQTP. This is not my favorite by any means, but it is widely used by a lot of companies in the industry. It stands for Quick Test Professional. This is a product by Hewlett-Packard. This tool helps testers to perform an automated functional testing seamlessly without monitoring once the scripts have been developed, or once the scripts have actually been developed or scripted. The biggest complaint I have with HPQTP is most of the QA testers, or most of the people that use it, can only do automation or testing with this tool. Unfortunately, if this is the first tool they are ever introduced to, that is all they will ever be able to do. It's very hard to get out of the mindset of that particular tool suite. One additional note, though, with HPQDP, they are not backwards compatible and do not export your test scripts into any other testing format. So if you do look at any of these tools, I don't recommend looking at the last one. Just be aware of it in case you go into a industry or run into a company that is using it. Unit tests. Well, basically, as stated, this is the definition. So it is a software development process in which the smallest testable parts of an application, called units, are individually and independently scrutinized for proper operations. So we're basically going to be taking a bunch of different components, testing components of our application, and we're going to basically turn them into unit tests. So, for example, this could be things like creating a product, creating a vendor, deleting a vendor. Each one of those actions signifies a specific unit test. Unit tests can also be done manually, meaning these could be manually tested by a user doing user acceptance testing or UAT. They can be tested doing record and playback. But typically, these unit tests, you want to script them once and put them into some form of an automated process. In the past, this screen has basically been our use case scenario for what we're trying to do with our product catalog. So today, I'm flipping it. So today, instead of us working on a use case, we're actually going to identify the stories or use cases that we want to test our application for. So the 5 main pieces we want to test is verify we can establish a database connection, verify that a new record is displayed in our list, be it product, vendor, whatever, verify that we can update a record and that it's reflected in the list. Verify a delete action, so when we delete something, we can test to make sure that it's removed from the list. Also, we can verify an existing record details is displayed correctly on the page. So before we begin building our test cases, we need to get a few things first. So to simplify building our test cases, we will begin with the Firefox Selenium IDE plugin. This will make the process of recording and playing back our test a snap. We will also continue to use the Spring framework and update our existing MVC applications with our unit tests. With that being said, we also need Firefox. So if you don't have Firefox, you also need to download Firefox. In addition to the Spring STS and Selenium, we will also be using WebDriver and Gecko to interact with Firefox and run our unit tests. So once I jump out of the slides here, we will start by taking a quick tutorial through the Selenium IDE. We will look at doing a simple record and playback test. And then we will move on from there and actually convert our recordings into unit tests. And then I'm going to show you how to actually build a unit test straight in Spring STC. And we're going to use that particular unit test to verify our database connection. All right, so now I'm going to jump out to the presentation part of this. So here is our product catalog code from the previous lesson. So in here we have our configuration file. This guy contains our viewer resolver, so it tells us where our views are, where our resources live, our database connection information for our data source, and our registered beans for our product and vendor. We have some controller files out here for our home page, our vendor, for our product and vendor. We also have some data objects, data access objects for inserting, updating, and deleting. This is the stuff we want to test and make sure that it works. And then we have our model, which is basically our POJOs, plain old Java objects. In our resources, we have the log4j, which is used for our logging. In our test Java, this is where we want to put our test classes. And under resources, this is where we're going to put our Gecko driver. This is the driver we're going to use to communicate with Firefox. Prior to Firefox 50, or actually I should say Firefox 48, Firefox, Chrome, Safari, IE, all used to be able to be directly communicated or manipulated from an API from the command line. However, after certain hacks and some, I guess, spyware that basically took advantage of these loopholes, they have since locked those down. So now you have, the only way you can communicate with the browsers from an application is to actually install some type of third-party driver. Gecko Driver is the most commonly used for Selenium. With Firefox, there is an IE driver you can download to interact with IE or Edge. Safari still doesn't have one, so you can actually still kind of communicate directly with Safari. And there is some other ones for some of the other browsers out there, but those are the most common three that you would use. We have our server started, so let's go take a look at our application. Still works. Our home page. And since I want to show the Selenium IDE only works in Firefox, so we have to go over to Firefox here. My home page. All right, so there's our home page for our catalog. So once you install the Selenium IDE, you can go out to add-ons, and the ones you want are basically anything that says Selenium capital IDE, and just download all the plugins for those. You also want to get the Selenium IDE button and just the plain old Selenium IDE. The Selenium IDE, you have to Google Firefox Selenium IDE plugin to get the actual plugin. For some reason, when you search from here, it doesn't always find it. So when you actually install the Selenium IDE button and everything else, when you try to run it, it'll say, oops, Selenium IDE not installed. Go to the site and download it. Once it's installed, though, you won't have the Selenium IDE button up here until you actually go to Customize and drag it up into your little window there, into your toolbar. Once you do have it, you can click the little drop-down arrow, and you have two options. You can open Selenium as a pop-up or as a sidebar. Depending upon the version of Selenium that you, or not Selenium, but of Firefox that you're using, the sidebar might not work as expected. So I always recommend opening the Selenium IDE as a pop-up. You'll get this nice little IDE window here, and you have the option of running your test fast or slow. There we go. Slow it down a little bit. You can view page coverage, change report folders. You can pause on fail. You can make a wait, run entire test suites. You can run single tests. So for right now, we're just going to record a simple test. So right now, it's new, it's untitled, we haven't saved anything yet. So let's click the little record button here. So it says now recording. So I'll click product. As you can see, it recorded my click event. So it opened the catalog. That was the start of the test. Click and wait. So it clicked, it waited till the page loaded. I'm now on the product screen. If I want to delete one of the ones I did, I can hit delete. However, because this is just a simulated test, it will fail because the ID won't be there. So we will just go in and do a new product. And we'll say, let's see, this product will be a Dr. Who hat. Summary, Tom Baker's hat. Awesome new hat. Baker. Price, we'll say $100. And quantity, we have one in stock. Okay. So as I've been typing, it has recorded all my typing events, and it has recorded the ID for each of the fields. So name, summary, description, price, and quantity. if the application you're working on, when they built the web application, if they did not use IDs properly, you will see either some XPath information or you'll see some very funky names. Then you saw I click the submit button, it grabbed the input, click and wait again, return me back. Number 12 is my new product. So now,
Hey, Michael, can I ask?
Yes, go ahead.
What do you mean about the IDs not being used properly?
Oh,
you may have mentioned this before. I can't remember.
I have not, and I did not get to that yet, but now's a good point. Let me jump in. So,
sorry.
Example, if your company is using a GUI generator like Visual Studios or maybe NetBeans or something like that, when you build an HTML page or form, sometimes it will put generated IDs in there, and sometimes they won't. One of the issues I'm currently running into is you can actually come in with WebDriver and actually validate all these table headers. In tables, you can actually walk through each record in a table. But the trick you run into is if you go inspect element, I didn't put an ID on that. So the only way I can get to that guy is to do Xpath. So then I have to do this gobbledygook here. Or you'll have some IDs that don't really tell you what the heck it is that you're looking for. So, for example, if I were to go back to new product and I wanted to do the input for this guy, so if that wasn't named, that could have been like JT_100. So if you try to convert this to code and you're trying to read it, you're going to have a hard time remembering what that is.
Yeah.
So it's just something to be careful of when you're working through it.
I got you.
All right.
Yeah, the reason I asked was because there's, for instance, if I'm using JBoss, and it's going to generate a lot of IDs for me, just because of the technology that's in use. I didn't know if that was going to be an issue, but Xpath sounds like it's the workaround.
It's not an issue, but here will be your issue. If you build any type of automation testing or any type of recorded test against it, verify that your JBoss is not set up that it basically rebuilds or regenerates the IDs every time the page is touched. That's one of the issues we're running into where I'm at now is Visual Studios and the Java server faces that they're the tool they're using to generate those automatically adds the IDs, but if they go in and they add an ID or they update something on the page, the moment they rebuild that page, all the IDs, they get renumbered.
I'm so sorry, I disconnected, but okay, keep going.
So basically, the big thing to consider with anything you're using that generates IDs, make sure they don't get regenerated if you come back and rebuild that page.
Okay, I'm with you.
A lot of GUI builders do that. So the only way to get around that is to actually assign it a unique ID, and then typically they don't regenerate.
I see. Good deal.
Any other questions on that? Because that was actually a very good question, Tim. Okay. So now that we've actually been clicking and playing on, it's been recording everything we've been doing. So now at this point, we will stop the recording here and then come over here and we'll play the entire test suite back. So it's going to go through, click, and retype everything. And it's going to fail because we were actually trying to do some things outside in the actual browser, which it won't let us do. But if I were to delete everything below that, which really didn't pertain to the test, there we go, and I were to rerun that guy, we now have 13 and 14, and we have a little green bar here, which told us that everything passed. So now we have recorded our first test case. So we come in here, we now have 12, 13, 14, and if I can actually go in and delete these to clean up. So that's essentially record and playback. So you could actually, what's kind of cool about this is you could actually do file, new test case, delete that. Actually, let me file, new test suite. Save. There we are. All right, so now this is a full test suite. So I could actually do one test case here where I will record. We will quickly do new, name, $1, save, stop that, and then I can do file, test case 2, record, delete, stop, test case, record, edit. And boom. Validation error. I did something. Oh, data too long for column name. Whoops. Go back. All right. As you can see, I've not added all the validation stuff yet for my tests.
Is that a database issue?
No, that is I have not finished adding all the validation for the user input fields. So we will update this one to. And this is the other thing. Once you've recorded the test, you can come in and modify it however you want. So we now have one that created one that deleted that will fail because that ID won't be there, and that edited one. And then let's go back and actually create one for vendor. Test. Now, edit that. Copy. Paste. Those. All right. So where I was going with this, all right, so we now have where we create a new product, edit a product, and now we create a new vendor. So now, if I just wanted to create a new product again, I could click the single line play, which will only run that test. And as you can see, we ran one test. Or I can run the full suite, which will run through and create a product, edit a product, and create a vendor. And the vendor one failed because I'm not on the, I didn't go back a page. So here's a cool part. I can click record, go back to home. Now I can do vendor. So now, come back up here and replay. It should create a product, edit a product, and now go back and create a new vendor. So that's record and playback. Any questions thus far with just the record and playback features of the Selenium IDE? Okay. Now, the next thing we're going to look at is we're going to take this test suite and we're going to export each of our tests to unit tests. So to do that, you select your test case, you file, export test case as, and for simplicity's sake at this time, we're just going to do Java JUnit WebDriver. This one is going to be create product test. There we are, create new product test. Java. Next one here is going to be edit product. And this one here is going to be create new vendor. Yep, okay, cool. All right, so then this one, for WebDriver. That guy down. Then if we go look at our files, copy these as is. Quick. Drop our new test cases in here. So we have create new product test. Of course, it's going to fail because it just drops in the com.examples test in their code. To easily fix that, you can click the little red X here and say change package declaration to your current path. Save that. No more errors. Good to go. And we essentially need to do this for all three of them. Walk through the here. All right, so what it essentially builds you is a unit test built for WebDriver. So it's going to give you a couple additional methods here that are underlined in yellow that aren't currently being used, but they're given to you just as an example so you can actually use them if you want to continue to build out your test. So a few things you need right off the bat. You're going to need whatever browser driver you want to use. And of course, you need to have the Selenium libraries. So if I hit Control-Shift-O, it'll tell us exactly what we need. We need the JUnit before, after, and test. These are the annotations that you need for all JUnit tests. The Selenium alert, by, these are for those methods that aren't currently being used. So for right now, I will drop those so we can that we focus only on what we need. Oh, there we go. All right, so we have by, which just allows us to look up our elements by ID or by Xpath or by CSS. WebDriver is the Selenium WebDriver tool or class that's used for all communications with the browsers. Then we come down into our class. So we have define our WebDriver. We create our base URL, which is our starting point. Don't need this guy right now. That was just there if we want to do alerts. And then string buffer for any verification errors that we want to record as we go through the test. All right, so this is at the startup of the test. So this is basically prepping the test to run. In here, this is where you want to define your driver, set your base URL, and set any other settings like waits or timeouts. So here, we're saying, hey, let's use the Firefox driver, set our base URL to our local host 9080 in our catalog. And this part here is interesting because you can also set your timeouts. So if a page takes more than 30 seconds to load, it's going to throw an error saying page timed out. Then the test part, so you can actually add multiple test annotations in here, and the test will actually run based on the order of the test. So if you want to kind of group multiple tests into one class, you can, but it's not recommended. Really, you want one test unit to be in each individual class. So in here, this is where our actions are. So get base URL, load our product, then find element by link text, new product. This will actually get a web element, and then from the web element, you can then click, you can, there's a couple of different methods here. So if I do dot, we have clear, so you can clear fields, you can click, you can check to see if the object equals another object. You've got the find elements by, so you can actually do a lookup. So in the case, if you don't have an ID, and you had to do a lookup by an Xpath to get, say, like a div tag, you could actually do a find elements by and look for a specific element inside of a div tag. I've actually had to use this multiple times when I get like an iframe or a pop-up. I can use this to get the pop-up and then do a find element or find elements and grab the elements that are in there and then loop through them, find the one I want, either by button or by ID, and then click it. So for pop-ups, I've had to do that a couple of times to where I've had to actually look for a return button or an OK button. Because sometimes when you're using like jQuery or some other JavaScript library, the pop-ups may not be a normal web browser pop-up. It could be an iframe. It could be something unique or specific. So you kind of have to be careful, and you can get creative with it. So they give you a lot of flexibility with the WebDriver and the web element classes. So here we start out, we clear the name field from any text that's in there. We then send keys, which are key press. We typed in name. You could actually do key press of /t for tab, or if you want to simulate a tab element, you could do keys dot alt arrow, and these are all the predefined command keys that are on your keyboard. You could actually do tab. So I've actually had to do this to simulate a user tabbing out to trigger an on click or an on event or an on focus action. Oops. Name. And we do the same for the rest of the fields that we're populating. And then the last thing here, so even though I do have an ID on the input, Firefox chose to use the CSS selector input type submit because it's a form element. So this is kind of the de facto way that Selenium does it. The other way I would probably do it would have been by ID, the ID name click. Once the test is finished, you have to do teardown. You want to make sure you close the browser and close the driver. So driver.quit will close the browser. Then kill the session with the browser, so essentially closing the Gecko driver. And then any errors that it received, you can then loop through and then return a fail and print out what the error was.
So all this code is So all this code is the one converted from the recording script?
Yes. So all this is this is just straight from the Selenium code. So this is the straight up record playback. This is what I was talking about at the beginning that a lot of companies choose to do, where they'll record thousands of these, convert them to unit tests, and they say they're done. They now have automation scripts. So they can now load all these into a Hudson, a Jenkins, Confluence, Bamboo, whatever they want for an automated test framework, and just run them through it. Downside, though, is if my page changes drastically or I drop a page, now I've got to go change all those tests, which typically means another record and playback session all the way through.
No.
Okay. Now, I'm running into a slight Mac issue kicking this off. You did see the record and playback. You saw how it interacted with the browser. I'm running into a very small, unsupported major and minor error with my Mac OS and Java. So we'll switch over in a minute, and I'll kind of show how this works on a different application that I've got in Windows. But for right now, let me go through the other test case. So the one test case that you can't really create using the Selenium WebDriver IDE is the database connection test. So to test our database connection, we kind of cheat because you don't necessarily have a connection to Tomcat from your product catalog from your test resources. So the quickest way to get to it is you can create a specific data source profile class for your database connections, or you can kind of cheat and extend your configuration class. So this is one reason why I like using configuration classes over the pure XML, because this way you can just extend a class and you have all your configurations. So if we go back to our MVC configuration file, as you can see in here, we define the bean for our data source, which has all of our database connections. If you have done this in XML, you would have had to create a separate class, define this information, and then pass it over as a profile. So this is just kind of a shortcut way of testing this. So we have our database connection test. It extends the MVC configuration, so we have access to the parent methods. Our test, public void test. Since I'm not actually loading anything, I'm extending. I don't need to have a before, and I don't need an after because I'm not really destroying anything or doing anything. However, one thing I did not do. Yep. Okay, everything's good there. All right. So I've got test, and I created a separate method here to give you an idea that you can still create utility methods or test methods that could essentially be reused by other test classes. But in this particular case, it's very simple. It's just is DB connected. It passes a string check query of select one. So if the database connection is valid, it'll run that. It'll get a 1 for pass, and it'll prove that the connection is stable. If the connection fails, it won't be able to run the select, and we'll get an error. So right now, everything's up. If I run this guy, unit test, boom, nice little green bar. Everything ran correctly. Test took 0.347 seconds. However, if I were to take a database down, I rerun that, it failed. And it failed because communication link failure. The database is currently down. Can't really see it, but I'm running MAMP. So right now the servers are down. If I start it back up, okay, everything's back up. I rerun that test. Boom, we pass again. So that's how you run your unit test.
So in unit testing, you don't have to verify the GUI, as long as it's green, then you go to the next one.
Exactly. And here's the fun part. So I can actually right-click on the package itself and do run as unit test, and it will try to run all the unit tests that are in your package.
Oh.
So you can use Maven and actually define this in the POM file. So when you build your project or you go to install your project, it will go through and it will try to run all your unit tests, and it will tell you if they pass or fail. And if they fail, it won't create the build. So you have to go back and fix your test before you can actually generate the build. Okay, no more questions. Anyone else have a question? Okay. So unfortunately, because I'm on Mac, and for some reason the terminal and the WebDriver are having a conflicting Java version, which should give you an indication of that. Maximize this. So the error message the biggest error message you will get, or that I've run across the most, is unsupported major and minor version 51, 52. 52 is Java 1.8, 53 is 1.9, and so forth. So apparently there is a conflict between my POM jar and the WebDriver version I'm trying to use. So we'll come back to that in just a moment. I do want to point out one other thing that we had to add to our project. So one of the things we did have to add to our projects to use the WebDriver are these three dependencies. So we need to include the org.selenium, hq.selenium, the Selenium-Java artifact, the Selenium-remote driver artifact, and the Selenium server artifact. You need the Selenium server artifact to and the Selenium remote driver artifact to communicate with the WebDriver, to communicate with the Firefox or whichever browser you want. If you just want to use the WebDriver locally and simulate things basically from text, you can just use the straight-up Selenium version here. But really, you need all three, and you need a version of or some type of WebDriver service.
Is there way you can manipulate this code I've seen, like there is Firefox, like in case I want to run it on a different browser like Chrome or IE?
Yes. So what I'm about to show you guys is the essentially the generated code from the test framework generator tool that I have built, that I'm currently in the process of marketing to companies. So hopefully it may run on this. Like I said, I'm having a slight issue with the Mac. I think it's because I took an update recently. Unfortunately, it was after I tested this. So bear with me for just a moment. I'm going to switch over to Windows, and hopefully we can do this in a Windows environment, and that should wrap up the demo here. Moment. Excellent. All right. Dave is in the room with me, so I'm using him as my guinea pig to see my screen. All right. So we now have our Windows open. Spring. I lost my timer, Rob. How are we doing on time?
It's 7:25, so we're roughly about where we want to be.
Just about done. So, all right. Once my test generator runs, typically the framework I have built breaks the WebDrivers and the whole framework into a different kind of level here. So you have your assertions, builders, controllers, data objects. But under generated, we have our library, have our WebDrivers here. Locking up here. Then we have our Firefox, Safari, Phantom.js, IE, HTML unit, Chrome. Go to the Firefox driver. To run him, you have to set some properties. And I define them down here. And I'll actually go into this when I discuss the automated. I'm actually going to do a presentation specifically on this because it fully goes into how to build your automation test cases cleanly and reusable in a way that with this little generator tool, if your project ever changed, you just click a button and boom, everything's updated. You just fix your tests or your page objects. So, all right, so if I go down to test, I have my Gecko driver, Phantom.js driver. I do everything through XML files. run as hopefully work the way I want them to work. Responding. Hopefully that's just a memory issue. Let me. Oh, there we go. Running. I'm using TestNG, which is just another JUnit test library. It expands JUnit, which gives you a little bit more flexibility with your startup and your build test scripts and your break teardown test scripts. So the test is running. It's opening up Firefox. And I know it's slow because I have everything open. So this is a product at the company I work at, just opened and failed because we just modified something. However, that's how the test works. So when the test opens, it opens up Firefox and then it'll walk through all the unit tests. And just give you an idea of how simplified my framework makes it. This is all you have to code for the test script once the framework is implemented. So we'll get into more on that at another time. But that's essentially what your test cases would look like once we get past our little error here. When we run these scripts here, that's what you would see. Firefox would open, essentially the same way we did the record and playback. So let's recap. So we discussed the importance of why we should test our code. As you can see, just in the example I had bugs. So the unit test catches when you have problems. You can just push a button, see what fails, and go fix it. We also looked at a brief overview of the different types of test frameworks. We also looked at using the Selenium testing tool, the IDE, and the WebDriver, and looked at the importance of building unit tests and how to make them work. In future discussions, we'll be discussing reporting, how to build a reporting against our database or our catalog, looking at using our product catalog with WordPress, probably some PHP and some HTML to actually embed it into our actual WordPress site. And I will probably also add another addendum to this one where we actually get more into how to take our test cases and create an actual automated test suite. With that being said, thank you for joining us today. Send any questions, comments, or requests for assistance to info@developernerd.com or just contact us through the site. So at this time, I'd like to open up for any questions.
So by recording, can you create a framework that you can reuse just in case, okay, if something changes in the workflow? Is that possible? Or
yes, it is. And I don't want to kind of put off that question beyond that, but for right now, yes, you can. I'll expand on that on the next one when I get into the automation, because when I show you what gets generated in more detail from my test generator, that's essentially it. What the biggest or the largest methodology I subscribe to is kind of the data-driven development hybrid with the module, and I also subscribe to the page object model philosophy where you put all of your page logic, all of your IDs and everything for each individual page into their own classes, and then you extrapolate from there. So you build your test using those classes, so if a page changes, you just go update the page class, and then your test should work. If anything gets removed, you go again fix that, and then you fix the page flows that broke for your test if you remove something. So it's a lot easier to maintain that way than the simple record playback where you have every single element ID for login in every single test. So if the login ID is changed, you now have to do a find replace all in your code and fix that. Or if you've now added another field, you now have to go add a brand new field to every single page. So like if before you had user ID and password, but now, now I want user ID, email, and password. Now you have to go add email to every single test that has a login. Whereas if you do it with the page object model, you just go add it to the login test, update page flow, all your tests work.
So is whatever Selenium strictly a Firefox?
No, Selenium is pretty much all open browsers. It supports just about every browser that's out there. If there isn't, typically it will support like the top 5, like Firefox, IE, Chrome, Safari, Opera, and they also have some headless ones like Phantom.js and Ghost Driver.
Now there is, Mike. There is at least I was thinking in the past, and you can clarify this. There is difference between the functionality on Selenium on the various browsers. Have they gotten that pretty much consistent across at least the major browsers?
That's because of the way that the WebDriver class is now built, addresses pretty much most of the issues that they had with that in the past. I would say probably about the time HTML5 became became standardized, about when WebDriver became stable through most modern browsers that support HTML5.
So can you get a conflict between like a unit test and manual test? For instance, a unit test might be showing green here, but when I'm doing a manual test, maybe I'm getting a bug. So
if you're doing the test the exact same way, that should not happen.
Oh, okay.
However, one of the biggest issues, if that does happen, one of the biggest issues that I've seen cause that is you have something cached.
Gotcha.
With the way that you can set up your typically when you start the test, there's some additional settings you can set at the beginning in the cookie. So, for example, you can turn cookies off. You can turn caching off. So basically, you always start with a clean browser. One of the other things to be careful of with doing tests is you want to make sure each test is focused on a single test unit. With that being said, based on your company's applications, there's exceptions to that rule. So within a test suite, you could potentially pass IDs from one test to another. I'm not going to expand on that at this time, but I'll save that for the next for the automation lesson. Any other questions?
So do all developers do unit tests, or do they just push out the code?
It depends on your shop. Most shops I have been in do little or no testing whatsoever, be it unit tests, QA. It's not the norm. It's getting better. More enterprise shops are subscribing to it. Sauce Labs has done a wonderful job of pushing it. Thanks to Selenium and WebDriver, it's becoming easier to get this stuff implemented, and it's more stable. The biggest issue, I would say about 5 years ago, when Firefox and all of them started getting hacked and started having all the spyware and bugs, when they made the shift over, that was when we had a lot of problems. Like Rob said, where the inconsistency between the browsers. That's because like Chrome would throw something out, and then now Chrome is incompatible with what Firefox is doing, or Firefox would kind of jump ahead. Pretty much up until recently, Firefox was always the one pushing all the browser development, debugging tools, Selenium. I mean, they worked hand in hand with Selenium. And then recently, when they had to make all these changes, Firefox kind of fell by the wayside a little bit. Chrome actually leapfrogged them a lot in their debugging tools and some of the testing tools. There's even like a Chrome Selenium plugin now. It's it's so hard because the browsers are changing so fast to keep up with the ever-changing world that is now mobile. We're no longer looking at standard desktops anymore. So Firefox now and Chrome both have the ability to switch agents. So you could actually even tweak Firefox to start up like it's loading on mobile. Same with Chrome. IE you can, but you have to find the right WebDriver to make that work. So if you get into the mobile side of this with these testing tools, you just have to be careful that you're using the right driver and you put in the right configuration settings. So pretty much what I've shown you so far is good for functional testing. I wouldn't get so much into, okay, at this resolution, this input box is at this position. With what I've shown you, don't try it at this stage. Save that for down the road when I show you some more advanced techniques and tricks as to what you can do with this. The other thing to be cautious of when looking at online tools, one of the biggest problems a lot of companies have, especially with test data, is if you're using any live credit cards or any live, like social security numbers or medical information on a QA box, which in some cases you want to because you have to test specifically what a particular client has. In cases like Selenium, that information can be cached out in the cloud. So you have a risk that if that server is open or happens to be gets hacked, your PMI or any of your secure information could be exposed. So a lot of companies, as far as Sauce Labs or any of the cloud-based tools, are hesitant to look at those. So that's where Selenium really can stand out because you can do a lot of the record playback, you can create the unit tests from your recordings, and then you can kind of map them into the page object model like I mentioned. Oh yeah, and the other little thing that I didn't mention, but I kind of glossed over as we were kind of walking through this, in Firefox, there is a very cool plugin. Xpath Checker and Xpath Finder. Those two combined give you the ability to right-click on an ID and view Xpath. And then you can just manipulate with Xpath code up here. There was no text. But this is a great way of getting Xpath information if the IDs you're looking for or the element does not have an ID.
You can also get it through Chrome. It actually is real easy to do. If you go into the dev tools and select an item, you can right click and it'll basically do a copy and paste of the XPath out of there as well. Both of those have gotten really good about making it easy to yank that out. And it's, if you've built the app yourself and everything's been done without generators or anything like that, you're in pretty good shape. But it seems like almost anything that uses a lot of frameworks will screw stuff up, and then a lot of the generators, you'll end up in a situation where you're going to have to, especially with complex interfaces, you have to dig in and find an XPath at some point or another if you're going to parse it at all.
Agreed.